The wind moved across the empty plain, like a whisper searching for someone to listen. Morning light spilled over the far ridges, touching the tips of dry grass with pale gold. But the world still felt cold, too wide, too silent. A woman walked through it, her thin shawl fluttering, her breath a cloud against the chill. Her name was not known here. People only called her the Apache girl, though she was no longer a girl. She carried the weight of someone who had buried too many memories beneath the same ground she now crossed. Her moccasins were torn, her hair, long and black as a raven's wing, caught on the wind and tangled across her face. She walked toward a town that had never welcomed her, a place where faces turned away as if grief were a kind of contagion. Each step she took left a faint print in the dust, and behind her trailed the echo of a story too heavy to speak aloud. Once she had a home, a mother who sang by the fire, a father who carved wooden flutes, a brother who laughed when thunder rolled. Then came smoke, gunfire, the screaming of horses, and the silence after. She survived, though she never understood why. The town came into view, a cluster of wood and brick, the scent of iron and smoke. Wagons creaked, doors slammed, and someone's dog barked sharply at her as she passed. She kept her eyes down, clutching a small basket of sewing she'd done for a woman who rarely paid what she promised. Her stomach ached from hunger, but she'd learned to live with that ache. It reminded her she was still alive. At the general store, she stood outside for a moment, gathering courage. Inside, voices mingled with the clatter of coins. She entered quietly, the bell above the door giving a brittle ring. A few heads turned. A man leaning against the counter muttered under his breath something about wild blood. A woman beside him gave a laugh, like glass breaking. The shopkeeper looked up, forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said, "Need something, miss?" She placed her small bundle of stitching on the counter. "I finished the work," she said softly. He picked up the cloth, turned it in his hands, and grunted, "Fine sewing, but I'll have to pay you next week. You know how things are." She nodded once. Pride was useless here. She stepped aside, letting others pass, and heard a voice behind her whisper, "No one wants to marry a woman like that, not even the drunks." The words landed like stones. She tried to stand tall, but her eyes burned. She left the store, stepping into sunlight so bright it hurt. For a moment she thought of turning back, demanding kindness, demanding justice. But what good would that do? The world did not bend for those like her. At the edge of town stood a trough, where horses drank. She knelt to cup some water into her hands, letting the coolness wash over her skin. As she straightened, her reflection wavered in the ripples. She saw a face both young and old, cheekbones sharp from hunger, eyes the color of storms. A tear fell, breaking the image. She whispered to the water, "No one wants to marry me. I've already lost my family." Behind her, a low voice said, "You shouldn't say that where the wind can't hear." She turned. A man stood a few paces away, tall, quiet, the sun behind him making his outline glow. His hat shadowed his face, but his eyes, steady and gray, watched her with a kind of patient sorrow. He was a stranger to her, yet something about him felt known, like a melody half remembered. He looked as if the world had tested him and found him still standing. She stepped back, unsure whether to flee or stay. "The wind doesn't listen to me," she said. "It listens to everyone," he answered simply, leading his horse to the trough. The animal drank while the man waited, gloved hands resting on the reins. She noticed how carefully he moved, as if each gesture had weight. He wore the dust of a long ride on his coat, and a scar curved faintly along his jaw. There was loneliness about him, but not the kind that begged, the kind that had made peace with itself. She watched him tie his horse and start toward the blacksmith's. He paused, glanced back once, and nodded as if tipping his hat to her unspoken story. Then he walked on. Later that day, clouds gathered over the hills, heavy with rain. The woman found herself near the outskirts, walking the road that wound past the open fields. The wind smelled of sage and wet earth. Ahead, a wagon wheel had broken, and two men struggled to lift it. She offered help, but they brushed her off with hard laughter. As she turned away, a familiar voice called from behind, "Hold on." It was the same man. He approached, kneeling beside the wagon. With calm precision, he fixed the axle, tightening the bolts without a word of complaint. When he finished, the men mumbled thanks and rode off without another glance. The rancher, she guessed he must be one, wiped his hands and looked at her. "You tried to help," he said. "They didn't want it," she replied. "Most men don't know what help looks like until it's gone." She wasn't sure what to say. They stood there, the storm close now, the air trembling. Lightning flashed over the horizon. She drew her shawl tighter. "You live near here?" he asked. "No home," she said. "Just work when someone offers it." He nodded slowly, as if confirming what he already sensed. "The land out west of town is quiet. My ranch sits in the valley. Too much work for one man, maybe. But it's peaceful." His tone wasn't an invitation, more like a truth spoken to the air. Still, her heart stirred. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier. He mounted his horse and said, "You should find shelter." She lifted her eyes to meet his. "You too." He gave a faint smile, almost shy. Then he turned his horse and rode into the curtain of rain, his figure fading like a memory returning to dust. She stood watching until he disappeared completely. The rain soaked through her shawl, but she didn't move. For the first time in a long while, she felt something shift, a small, fragile warmth inside her chest. Not hope, not yet, just the quiet ache of being seen. When she finally walked back toward town, the world seemed changed. The wind carried his words through the rain. The land out west of town is quiet. She didn't know why those words stayed with her, but they did. Like the start of a path she wasn't meant to miss. By nightfall, a thin trail of smoke rose from the hills beyond the plain. She watched it from her small rented room, the window fogged from her breath. Somewhere out there, the rancher was tending his fire. She pressed her hand to the cold glass, whispering into the dark. Maybe the wind was listening after all. And in that moment, before the candle went out, she thought she heard the faint echo of a man's voice carried through the storm, soft, distant, almost tender. "Come with me." Rain came like a veil over the land, soft and cold, muting every sound except the rhythm of water against earth. The woman walked the long road again, the same worn shawl pulled close, her basket clutched under her arm. The sky had turned the color of pewter, and the prairie grass bent in the wind like hands pressed in prayer. She had set out to find work at the farms near the valley, though she carried little hope. Hope, she'd learned, was an expensive thing to borrow. When the thunder rolled behind her, she almost didn't notice the horse until it stopped beside her. The hooves sank softly into the mud. A deep voice said, "You'll catch fever walking in this weather." It was him, the rancher. His hat brim dripped with rain, his coat dark with wet. His horse snorted, breath visible in the cold air. She hesitated, unsure if she should speak or keep walking. He extended a hand without another word, offering the shelter of his coat, as he'd done before. She moved closer, standing beneath the fabric, her shoulder brushing his arm. The scent of leather and wood smoke clung to him. They walked slowly together through the storm. Their steps matched, their silence not awkward but strange and peaceful. After some time, he nodded toward the horizon. "There's a cabin ahead," he said. "Belonged to an old hand who left years ago. Roof still holds. You can wait out the rain." She studied his face, lined, steady, eyes tired but kind. Trust was a luxury she could not afford, but weariness won over fear. When they reached the cabin, he pushed open the door and stepped aside for her to enter first. Inside, the air smelled of dust and cedar. Cobwebs hung like threads of forgotten dreams. She brushed her hand along the table, leaving a streak through the years of neglect. He placed a few logs in the fireplace, struck a match, and lit a small flame. The warmth spread slowly, the firelight painting his features in shades of amber. He spoke softly. "You can stay here if you like. The storms are worse near the river. It's quiet land. You could earn a bit helping around the ranch." She turned toward him, wary. "Why offer this to me?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze went to the window, where the rain traced long silver lines. "Because I know what silence feels like," he said, "and because no one should walk alone in it forever." Something inside her cracked, the part that had learned to expect nothing. She sat by the fire, wordless, while he hung his coat on a nail and went about mending the window latch. The simple sound of him working filled the room. When he left for his house later that evening, he paused at the door. "If you change your mind," he said, "you can come by the ranch tomorrow. There's plenty to do." She nodded but gave no promise. After he disappeared into the rain, she stared at the flames until they burned low, wondering what kind of man speaks kindly with nothing to gain. By morning, sunlight poured through the cracks in the shutters. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. She stepped outside, inhaling the scent of wet sage and pine. In the distance, she saw smoke rising from the valley, the ranch. For reasons she didn't fully understand, her feet began to move toward it. When she arrived, Elias Ward, she had heard his name whispered once, was already at work, feeding the horses. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable but gentle. "You came," he said. "I came," she replied simply. He handed her a brush. "Then start with him," he said, nodding toward a chestnut mare with a scarred flank. "She's got more spirit than most folks can handle." She began brushing, slow and careful. The mare shuddered at first, then settled under her touch. Elias watched from a few paces away, his hands folded over the fence rail. "Animals know who means them harm," he murmured. "She trusts you already." The days that followed unfolded quietly. She swept the cabin, patched the roof, washed the windows until they gleamed. In return, he brought her food, beans, bread, once even a jar of wild honey. They rarely spoke much, but their silences grew soft, filled with a rhythm that didn't need words. Sometimes, at dusk, she would hum old Apache songs by the fence, her voice low and lilting. He would sit on the porch, listening, eyes distant but peaceful. Once she caught him smiling faintly, and it startled her, how a man could carry both grief and gentleness in the same breath. One evening, as the sun melted behind the hills, he came to her cabin with a lantern. "Town's been talking," he said quietly. "They say things about you. About me." Her stomach tightened. "They always do," she answered. He studied her face. "Does it bother you?" "Not as much as it used to," she said. "But I hate that it might hurt you." He shook his head. "Let them talk. I stopped listening a long time ago." Still, the words lingered in the air between them. She looked away, staring at the fading light through the window. "They'll never see me as anything but what I was born," she whispered. He stepped closer, setting the lantern down. The flame trembled, throwing gold across her face. "I see you," he said. "That's enough." She wanted to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she looked at his hands, rough, scarred, yet steady, and felt something deep inside her settle. It was not love, not yet, but a kind of safety she had forgotten existed. The next morning brought trouble. She went to the town's market to trade some woven cloth, and the whispers followed her like shadows. A man near the blacksmith spat near her feet and muttered, "Elias Ward's gone soft for a savage." The others laughed. Before she could respond, a silence fell. Elias was there, his coat still dusty from the fields. He didn't raise his voice or lift his fists. He simply stepped beside her and looked at the men until their laughter died. "She's under my roof," he said quietly, "and under my respect." The crowd turned away one by one, their cruelty shrinking under his calm. She stood frozen, her throat burning. When the square was empty, he looked at her with concern. "Are you all right?" She could barely speak. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." They walked back together, saying nothing. The afternoon light turned golden, the wind carrying the scent of rain yet to come. When they reached the valley, she stopped at the gate and turned toward him. "Why are you kind to me?" He leaned on the fence, eyes soft but serious. "Because kindness saved me once. Maybe I'm just returning the favor." She wanted to ask what he meant, but he only smiled faintly and walked toward the barn. She watched him go, her heart heavy with questions she was afraid to voice. That night, she sat by her window, listening to the coyotes call across the hills. The fire in her hearth burned low. shadows flickering along the walls. She touched her chest, feeling her heart beat steady, unfamiliar warmth spreading where there used to be only emptiness. Outside, thunder rumbled again, distant but moving closer. She rose, went to the door, and stepped into the cool night air. In the distance, she saw a lantern still burning at the ranch house. She knew it was his. The light flickered through the dark like a heartbeat, steady, patient, waiting. For the first time, she didn't feel alone beneath the vast western sky. Yet somewhere in that peace was fear too, the quiet terror of beginning to care. And as the wind swept through the valley, she whispered to herself, barely audible against the coming storm, "If the wind is listening again, let it not take this from me." The days turned to weeks, and the valley began to bloom. Spring softened the earth, and wildflowers pushed through the soil like forgotten prayers. The woman had learned the rhythm of the ranch, the way the horses called at dawn, the quiet hum of the river through the canyon, the sound of Elias's boots on the porch each morning. She worked beside him, and though they spoke little, something invisible threaded between them, fragile but strong. Yet peace, she knew, was never left untouched for long. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the road, a dust-covered man from town. He stopped near the fence, his voice sharp and cold. "Elias Ward, you got company," he called. Elias stepped from the barn, wiping his hands. The man spat on the ground. "Town council's talking. They don't like you keeping her here. Folks are saying you've forgotten where you belong." His gaze slid toward her, standing by the water trough. "And you, girl, don't think you can hide behind him forever." Elias's face did not change, but his eyes hardened. "You said what you came to say," he replied. The man sneered, turned his horse, and rode off. Dust swirled behind him, settling slow. When he was gone, Elias looked at her, his jaw tight. "They won't stop," she said softly. "They'll tire," he answered. But even as he said it, she heard the doubt beneath the calm. That night, she could not sleep. The wind rose through the valley, moaning against the eaves. She stood by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the hills, silvering everything it touched. In her chest, a deep ache stirred, the memory of another night, another threat, long ago. Fire shouting, her father's hand torn from hers. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, whispering a prayer to spirits she wasn't sure still listened. At dawn, she found Elias already outside, splitting logs. His movements were deliberate, steady. When he saw her, he paused, leaning on the axe. "You look like you didn't rest," he said. "Maybe I'm waiting for something to break," she murmured. He set the axe aside and walked closer. "If it breaks, we'll mend it. Same as anything else." His words steadied her, though fear still lingered like smoke. The next few days brought tension that could be felt in the air. Men from town began riding past more often, eyes following her as they passed the ranch fence. They never spoke, but their silence carried weight. She tried to keep working, feeding the chickens, mending the harness, but each glance toward the road felt like a warning. Elias noticed too. He started keeping a rifle near the porch, though he never raised it. One evening, as the sun fell low, a group of riders appeared again, for this time. They stopped at the gate, the horses restless beneath them. Elias walked out to meet them, his expression calm, but his stance solid. "You've got no right keeping her here," the first man said. "She's trouble, and you know it. You'll lose your ranch before summer if you keep playing the hero." Elias's voice was quiet, but it carried. "She's done no harm. She works harder than most men in this valley. You got a problem with that. You can leave your words here and ride back." The man's hand went to the gun on his hip. For a moment, everything froze, the horses breathing, the air thick with dust and pride. Then she stepped forward, trembling but fierce. "Enough," she said. "You've already taken everything once. I won't let you take peace too." The men turned to her, startled. "You think your words matter here?" One spat. She met his eyes without flinching. "They matter to me." Elias stepped beside her. "And to me." His voice was low, but there was something unyielding in it. "If I lose this land, I'll lose it standing with her, not bending to you." For a heartbeat, No one spoke. Then the leader laughed, sharp and bitter. "You'll regret it," he said, and spurred his horse. The others followed, the sound of hooves fading down the road until only the wind remained. When silence returned, she exhaled shakily. Elias turned to her. "You didn't have to face them," he said. "I did," she answered. "If I don't, I'll always be running." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "You're braver than you think." That night, rain came again. They sat inside the cabin, the firelight flickering across their faces. Outside, thunder rolled like a drumbeat, steady and distant. She poured tea, hands trembling slightly. "They'll come back," she said quietly. "Maybe," he replied, "but they'll find the same answer waiting." She looked into the flames. "I used to dream someone would see me," she said. "Not pity me, not fear me, just see me." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I think you've been seen for a long time," he said. "You just didn't know where to look." Her breath caught. She met his gaze, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "And what do you see?" she asked. He didn't smile, but his voice softened. "A woman who survived what would have broken most men. A woman who deserves to stop surviving and start living." Something deep within her shifted then, a door opening where none had been. She reached out, fingers brushing his hand, unsure if it was right, but unable to stop. He turned his palm upward, closing it gently around hers. The warmth between them was steady, not wild, but it filled the room like light after a long night. Weeks passed, and the world did not end. The men from town stayed away. Work continued, and laughter began to appear between their silences, rare, quiet, but real. The horses grew fat with spring grass, and wildflowers spread across the hills like spilled paint. One morning, he came to her cabin with a small box. Inside lay a simple silver ring, old but polished. He looked uncertain, as if afraid to break the stillness between them. "I can't give you much," he said, "but I can give you my name, if you'll take it." Tears stung her eyes. "You'd marry me?" He nodded once. With pride, her hands trembled as she lifted the ring. "Then yes," she whispered. With pride, they were wed quietly beneath the cottonwood by the river, with only the sound of water and wind as witness. She wore a white shawl she had sewn herself, and he looked at her as though he were seeing the first sunrise after a lifetime of storm. When they joined hands, the world seemed to still, as if even time wished to watch. That evening, they stood together on the porch. The valley spread before them like a living painting. The sky burned gold, then softened to violet. She leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "I never thought I'd belong anywhere again." He placed his arm around her. "You always belonged," he said. "The world just took a while to remember." The wind rose gently, carrying the scent of rain and wild grass. She closed her eyes, listening. Somewhere in that sound, she thought she heard the echo of her own voice from long ago, lonely, lost, and the whisper of his answer through time and distance. "Come with me." For a moment, she almost believed the wind itself was smiling. Then the first drops of rain fell, soft against their joined hands, as the world turned quietly toward tomorrow.